evening, everyone. So I think we've got two challenges. First, is the last session, so keeping everyone interested, and we're only half an hour late, so we'll keep it on time. So I'm sure you're all looking forward to your Italian wine. So we'll make sure it's short and sweet.
By any chance?
And the second challenge is to come with a capabilities checklist, and we only have an hour for that. So, and it seems like it's been worked on for 30 years or more. So for dynamic competition. So, but to do this, we've got three distinguished academic. I'll start with Frederic, who is the chairman of the OECD Competition Law and Policy Committee. And next to me, there is David, who is the professor in global business and director of Teece Center for Management and of Intellectual Capital at, sorry, I forgot the university, UC Berkeley, sorry. And Bill Kovacic, who is a global competition professor of law and policy at George Washington University, and former chair of the Federal Trade Commission as well. So we'll start with a presentation from David, who's worked a lot on the framework for dynamic capacities. So to set the scene.
All right, thank you for that. And I'll try and just be brief to set the stage. First of all, we've heard many wonderful talks today, but in a way, I feel with the Dynamic Competition Initiative, our job is to fuse the brilliance of Pierre and the brilliance of Brian. They both happen to be graduates of the economics program at Berkeley. And so, Pierre has really got a deep background in applying competition policy to real world problems. Brian is a little more abstract. But one approach is reductionist to some extent, and the other one is a systems approach. And so I think what's needed is a systems approach which addresses head on the problems that we have to look at in competition policy. So that's really the foundation stone of dynamic competition. It's a systems approach to looking at competition issues. And in that systems approach, it goes beyond neoclassical economics. It adopts, recognizes not just a disequilibrium world, but it also recognizes that capabilities matter. And this is the big, in my view, one of the key reasons why we've had trouble with competition policy in recent years is it's not the law, it's the economics. And the supply side is being read out of the story because the theory of the firm in economics, despite the fact that 3 Nobel laureates have been dished out for the theory of the firm, one to Williamson, one to Coase, and one to Oliver Hart, we're not far along. We're not very far along in terms of really understanding at an abstract level so that we can push it straight into competition policy. We're not really far along with respect to understanding the business firm, particularly those that are engaging in digital transformation. So we have this great gap, and in my view, that requires that we come up with a theory of capabilities. Alfred Marshall was moving in that direction, and then the neoclassical economics whipped it off into simple theories of production that led to the classic supply and demand analysis. And no one in a business school takes that supply curve stuff very seriously. So we've got a lot of backfilling to do. So what is the nature of some of the backfilling we have to do? Well, particularly in the context of innovation in the digital economy, I would say one of the key things we have to do, first of all, is really focus a lot more on future markets or potential competition. In some sense, the focus is always on actual competition. And if you get to potential competition, it's an add-on, it's not taken seriously. But in essence, if you look at Silicon Valley, where are people focused? It's not so much on the actual competition, it's on the future competition, it's on potential competition. And we really don't have very good theories of potential competition. And we can't assess who are the likely future potential competitors because we don't have the supply side worked out. We don't have a theory of capabilities. And that's, of course, animated my own research for quite some time. So we have this wonderful beneficiary from the Chicago school. We got economics into competition policy. The problem is the wrong economics got in. It was static micro theory, and the post-Chicago folks have juiced it up a little bit, but it's still static micro theory. Of course, from time to time, it brings a time dimension in and does a few other things, but basically it's cabined in. It's cabined in very narrowly. So post-Chicago gave us, in some sense, more of Chicago, if you're thinking of it in terms of what matters, which is innovation. So with a dynamic competition initiative, the view is not just that innovation drives, that competition drives innovation, but it's that innovation also drives competition. There's a deep endogeneity. And I guarantee you, if you look at the standard competition economics literature, 98% of it is around how competition is important for innovation. And of course it is, but so is innovation important for competition. So unless you recognize this endogeneity, you're going to go off half-cocked all the time. So there's two fundamental classes of problems we have to deal with. One is the lack of endogeneity, you know, the other one is the lack of any kind of serious supply side thinking. So if we can fix that, I think we can make considerable steps forward. Now, of course, the pressure is on now for results. You know, every time I give a talk, which isn't all that often, about, you know, competition economics and what we need to do, everybody looks at you, well, David, well, we got to make this operational. What have you done? Well, my response is, well, it's been 30 years we've been sitting back doing nothing. Why is the burden on just a few of us? There's a whole community of scholars out there. There must be 10,000 competition economists or something like that. And how about we just have 10% of them start working on this seriously? Maybe we'd make some serious forward progress. So really there's been neglect, and that is because I think there's there's insufficient recognition of the fundamental nature of the problem. So so one is we need to, first of all, understand potential competition a lot better, and we need to understand capabilities a lot better. With respect to capabilities, we are at a pretty primitive stage, but notwithstanding that, in the field of organization theory and in the field of corporate strategy or strategic management, there's actually a lot of work on capabilities. But I guarantee you, if you read the competition economics literature, I doubt you'll find a single site across, someone will prove me wrong, I hope, to these other literatures. So there's been siloed thinking and siloed research going on, and disrespect, not so much disrespect, it's either ignorance of or not able to connect the dots between how do you pull these literatures together. And quite frankly, it's hard, but it's not all that hard. So we need to find a way to, and this is following Brian Arthur's complexity theory and complexity economics, you've got to look with a much wider lens, a much wider aperture lens. And so long as we stay in our silos, we'll keep making mistakes. So bringing capabilities in, and then maybe the way to do it, I'm in favor of maybe an incremental approach. It's too big a jump to say throw everything out the door, out the window, and start afresh. Maybe one way is that, if to the extent to which you believe in anything about relevant markets telling you something about competition, maybe you could have plus factors and minus factors depending on your analysis of capabilities. Look, market share analysis and HHIs is backward looking. If you live in Silicon Valley, no one looks backwards, but that's what the competition authorities do. That's what looking at data on markets and the history of markets. Now, there's something to be learned from history, don't get me wrong, but taking a snapshot of where you are is like trying to drive a car by looking in the rear vision mirror. So how do we look forward? Well, we first of all start building in evolutionary economics, and we start building in better theory of potential competition. And there's something that we can say about that. In fact, let me jump to that just to illustrate that I think there is something that you can do short term to start shoring up this problem. There's a useful literature that's emerged on so-called nascent competitors. You know, there's been potential competitors, but nascent competitors are not ones that are in the market, but ones that are maybe emerging, and it recognizes implicitly an evolutionary story of growth. And you know, this is where competition economists have to start thinking like venture capitalists. You're not going to always get it right, but you have a chance of doing better if you look at a few simple things. Does this nascent competitor have a viable business model? It's the most obvious thing to ask, but, you know, let's take the Giphy case, which I know others in the room have studied. The British competition agencies didn't really bother to ask that question and figured that Giphy was a viable competitor, despite the fact that it didn't have a viable business model. Does it have a technology that is technically feasible? These are simple things that venture capitalists look at. Is there a management team in place that can manage? Is there venture capitalists to support the company? I think in the case of Giphy, almost all of those was missing. And yet the British Competition Agency came to the view that somehow or other was a nascent competitor and was about to take on Facebook. You know, that is a sophomoric view. If you're in an MBA class, even the bottom quartile of the class would figure out that that's not likely to happen. But of course, it's all about likelihoods, never about certainty, which raises another big question, which is once you move into the world of complexity theory and complexity economics, where everything depends on everything else, the uncertainty factor goes up. And so there's a great tendency to say, we can't talk about this. We can't talk about the quality of management. We can't talk about viable venture capital. So instead, what do we do as economists? Well, we just assume that anything that's financeable will be financed. Well, that's a bad assumption, but that's the kind of trap that we fall into. I tend to be an optimist that even though there's a lot of complexity, I do think that these issues can be resolved through further research. But there's no research or very little research being done on it. There's a lot of effort going into creating yet another formal model of this and yet another formal model of that. But let's instead focus on evidence. Let's, you know, build these case studies. Let's get a deep understanding. Let's port across the existing bodies of knowledge in the field of strategic management and entrepreneurship. So this is where Chicago got it wrong. There was an old Chicago tradition from Hayek on and back to Frank Knight around sort of entrepreneurship. We've got to bring entrepreneurship studies into competition policy. How can we talk about nascent firms, nascent competitors, if we don't know something about entrepreneurship? The literatures are there. They're there. There's an enormous amount of empirical work on this stuff now. But the competition agencies seem to be have an allergic reaction to touching these literatures. At least that's my observation from afar. So let me just make a couple of other points. I think I've stirred the pot enough to, I'm sure, get a number of comments from each side. But there's a number of things then we have to abandon. One is the infatuation with efficiency. Efficiency is an old world industrial age concept. And you don't solve the problem by putting the word dynamic in front of it. There is a large literature in organizations that says that firms that pursue efficiency are unlikely to be innovative. Those that are innovative are unlikely to be efficient. In fact, they don't need to be very efficient. If your product is X amount, you know, order of magnitude better than somebody else's, it doesn't have to be efficient. You can work that out later. But this sort of shows that while competition economists love the notion of studying disruption, they don't want to be disrupted themselves with the models that they use. So this is the way to avoid disruption. Let's call efficiency dynamic efficiency and then declare we're doing dynamic economics when we're not. So innovation first has to be competition economics that is consistent with dynamic competition has to be innovation first. And that brings us to simple things like entry barriers. There's this presumption in economics that an entry barrier is always something that keeps a competitor out. You live in Silicon Valley, an entry barrier of an established firm is something that actually keeps the incumbent trapped and enables the new entrant to come in. So it's an invitation to entry, an entry barrier in the classic industrial sense, an invitation because they're inflexible, because they've got all this, this investment, which through the eyes of industrial economists, this investment is something that deters competition and so forth. In fact, it's just the opposite if you're armed with a new technology. So we have to completely re-engineer the way we think about entry barriers. And then, I could keep going on and on here, but I won't because my colleagues have got a lot to say. Other than, my ending point will be administrability is not immediate in totality. There are things that we can get into the enforcement agencies now that I think will make a difference. The most important thing we can get in is essentially a new set of lenses for looking at the current problems. I actually think competition agencies will get to the right answers quicker if they're not handicapped by some of this apparatus of neoclassical economics, which actually holds them back. And it's very subtle, it's very indirect, and they don't even know it's holding them back. They're trying to do what they consider to be good economics, but it's actually reductionist and it's static. And just by calling it dynamic doesn't make it anything but static. So I think that there's a way to go forward here rapidly. And then through learning, I think once you tear off the blinders, you'll get rapid learning, and we have a much better chance of getting better policy. I think, like, I look at the European DMA, and I'm so sad because it was concocted without any understanding of dynamic competition. In my view, it was concocted in the name of dynamic competition, but I think with hindsight, it'll turn out to be just the opposite, because there were no frameworks out there. And if it's a big mess, we as an economics profession have to take some of the responsibility. We sat on our hands for 30 years and denied the policymakers the kind of rich research base that could have actually led to a better outcome.
Thank you to Bo and to David, to Nicola and the entire DCI team for the great pleasure of being here today and tomorrow. Thanks for putting this together and giving me a reminder of why I wanted to be an academic 35 years ago. It's delightful to be here. For today, I wanted to see if I could look at the experience of competition policymaking and ask if it's been quite so bleak as David suggests in this respect, and to see whether we've done anything in the past that incorporated some of these ideas. I think I've got an example. I'm not going to assert that it's a perfect incorporation of some of the insights into policymaking, but I do think it suggests some important ways in which people thinking about this over time have at least picked up some of the concepts and put them to work. And I want to talk about aerospace and defense to come up with the title of our session, a capabilities checklist for dynamic competition. Why is defense and aerospace so interesting? One, you'll not find another field in human experience that has featured more technological dynamism, and dynamism not simply driven by curiosity, though sometimes, but driven by a sense of absolute necessity and very survival. So the urgency to get it done and do it well is unsurpassed. What matters in the sector is innovation and quality. When the Department of Defense purchases a sensor that's going to go on a satellite to tell you whether or not the forces of an adversary are mobilizing on the border of another country, including with engineering units that are ready to plunge across the border, they're not thinking, can I get this for $15 less a copy? They're thinking about, can I read the serial numbers on tanks to get an idea of exactly where they came from? Quality and technological superiority are absolutely paramount. Next, we've actually had a lot of experience dealing with every complex, difficult innovation market issue you can imagine in the context of looking at aerospace and defense mergers, especially since the early 1980s, when there were a great number of consolidation events in the sector. I count over 50 of these that the Department of Justice or the FTC looked at. Did they use a lot of traditional tools? Indeed, they did. Are the blinders that David referred to sometimes evident? Yes. But was there, I would say, a willingness to look at other considerations and to put themselves in the shoes of the major purchasing agencies to ask what mattered to them in deciding who was good at doing this? And that perspective pushed you automatically into the field of evaluating competencies and capabilities. Because for the entire US experience in the run-up to the World War II mobilization and since, the crucial strategy of the defense purchasing agencies has been to increase capabilities. Firms get funded from DoD according to their ability to demonstrate that a specific project will give them a competency that is valuable in solving problems for the national security agencies in the future. Some of these contracts are $5 to $10 million. Some of them are $5 to $10 billion. And whether it's the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, whether it's the individual services, on a day-to-day basis, they're paying for capabilities. They don't know exactly how the capabilities will be applied in the future. They do know that they will have difficult problems to be solved, such as, do you want your strategic nuclear force buried in silos in North America, flying in planes, or yes, the best solution of all, on submarines that are almost undetectable? They wanted somebody to solve those problems. The investment in capabilities led them to a diversified strategic force that gave them, in particular, a single solution packed into others that had the greatest survivability. And there is within the defense community in the field of defense economics, but bodies such as RAND, since the mid-1940s, have produced a large empirical and conceptual literature that I think picks up a number of the ideas that David has identified as being very important, properly identified as being very important. And an example I'll touch upon, launch vehicles, but I'll just tell you that all of the incredible things happening today with uncrewed aerial vehicles, drones, and with launch vehicles could not have happened without this. And for all of the concerns about the death of competition and how we've had in the United States 40 years of failure in competition policy, yes, that's me. None of these things could have happened without good policymaking choices on the public funding side, and I'd say on the enforcement side as well. We're observing right now a number of the consequences of choices that I think reflected some of these considerations. What competencies matter? I've just picked a few that run through the mind of the Department of Defense and its purchasing agencies. These are the things they fund. One, can you give us stealth? Do you have the ability to make your system low observable? What skill do you have in designing aircraft, missiles, other mechanisms that avoid ready detection by an opponent? That's a competency. How good are you at materials? Are you able to come up, for example, with better and better composite materials, which perform the miracle of giving you greater strength but lighter weight, with weight for aircraft being the enemy of performance? If I can build something lighter and stronger, I've made a huge jump in performance. To take a more narrow example, can you build a vehicle that can take off and land on an aircraft many times and keep performing well? Do you have the ability to do that? I was once at a deposition in my former life for 3 years, working where my main client was McDonnell Douglas, and being with McDonnell Douglas engineer once, who's asked by the opposing party, well, can you land a commercial airliner on an aircraft carrier? And my client said, yes, you can. And the other lawyer said, aha, got you. He said, yes, you can do it once. You will never do it again. You'll have to cart it away. Aerodynamics and maneuverability. Not that you should spend your time doing these things, but as a guilty pleasure, if you've watched Top Gun Maverick, you see scenes at the end of the movie where a jet aircraft seems to suddenly come to a stop, stand up in the air, and using a vulgar and non-creative form of expression, Tom Cruise and his colleagues say, what the was that? Yeah, airplanes can do that now. They can stop on a dime. They can turn upside down. There's a real skill in building shapes that allow you to do that. And avionics, the typical aircraft or missile today is a big computer that's attached to an engine. And can you build and construct those kinds of systems? These are all capabilities that the Department of Defense and its affiliated services fund all the time. Some for existing needs, but so much of it is we don't know exactly what problem we're going to face tomorrow. We have some idea, but we need an adaptable system of suppliers who have broad abilities that we think are going to be important to solving those problems in the future. There's another set of competencies that are crucial to deciding who can do this stuff. Many of these are technical and managerial. You know, David, I think, quite well spoke to the importance of managerial skill and acumen. Can you take a number of different subsystems and integrate them into an effective single system that's going to be a weapon system? Can you design and produce components yourself? Are you any good at actually making the stuff that you're talking about? How good is your testing and evaluation regime to simulate whether or not it's going to work in practice? Can you do a good job of training the people who are going to use it and supporting them as they do? Are you good at making refinements and adjustments over time? Because given the complexity and uncertainty of what we, the military services, do, it is the rapid, immediate adaptation of a system that's been fielded that tells us what we have to do to make it effective and survivable. Can you do that for us? And can you take existing units and upgrade them dramatically over time? Show us, have you done these? You might not have to do all of these, but the more of these capabilities that you have, the more promising your possibilities for being an effective supplier in the future. What trends do we see from this body of experience with aerospace and defense? Current skill in production, as David was saying before, is not necessarily a good index about whether you're going to be good tomorrow. And there have been so many instances where firms with mature and elaborate current production programs have not quite exited, but gone to the sidelines because they weren't building the capabilities necessary to build the next one and to do it well. Lockheed Martin, for a period of 3 decades, did not build a combat aircraft of any kind. They did have a prototypical group called the Skunk Works that made iconic aircraft such as the SR-71, the U-2, but because they were doing those things well and because they were being funded to improve stealth technology, out of nowhere, they come up with a design that's called the F-117, which is the world's first truly effective stealth fighter, virtually undetectable on a radar screen at the time. Firm culture and the extent to which it seeks to develop and maintain competency to innovate is crucial. Northrop Grumman was the subject of a takeover by Lockheed Martin in the late 1990s. The Department of Justice sought to block it. A crucial basis for doing this was that Northrop Grumman had a history of looking for unconventional approaches to solving problems. Whereas Lockheed Martin was somewhat more traditional, Northrop Grumman wasn't. It was the source of a number of innovative aircraft designs. The intuition of the Department of Justice, supported by the Department of Defense, is you want to maintain them as an independent focal point for design and development activity. You want to do that over time. Indeed, it's Northrop Grumman that, in thinking about new ways to solve the problem of combat over the battlefield, says it'd be great to have something that doesn't involve putting a human being in that machine. Coming up with a big machine about the size of this room. The Northrop Grumman product is called the Predator. that can loiter in the air for 48 to 72 hours, and yes, carry munitions as well, and sensors. Northrop Grumman came up with that as a solution, partly because of the capabilities it maintained, but also its culture. The government's played a crucial role as a buyer and almost a venture capitalist on its own. One of the transactions that identifies this, and I'll leave you with this example, involved the creation of the United Launch Alliance. In 2007, Lockheed Martin and Boeing, the only two producers of launch vehicles to put national security payloads in space, formed a joint venture, a merger to monopoly, as it's called in our field. The Department of Defense wanted it, came to the FTC that was reviewing it and said, we're going to steamroller you. And that was a credible threat. We were in the position of simply saying, what are you doing to support alternatives? And there was one alternative. And by the way, the United Launch Alliance had an efficiency story that might also be an innovation story. It was that neither of us are doing enough launches to be really good at it anymore. You put us together and the learning curve benefits will elevate the level of success for launches from 9 out of 10 to 95 out of 100. What's the additional 5? That's a $2 to $5 billion satellite that will be positioned in the right place to watch, take pictures, and listen. Very important at moments when you're trying to monitor the behavior of an obstreperous nation that's trying to do things that are dangerous to the rest of the world. That was their story about learning and efficiency. And the question on our part was, can we persuade any of the purchasing agencies to invest in building capabilities for someone else? There was a someone else. And they had a great business model in the way that David just described it. They said, it's stupid to launch vehicles, use them once and not use them again. How about a launch vehicle that you launch, you can come back and land and use it again, refurbish it? How about new materials that are lightweight, strong, and effective? We'll do that. How about the revolution in electronics that allows you to do brilliant things with guidance? We think we can do that as well. We can make a space age cockpit that you haven't seen before that looks like Star Wars. And how about people who have innovative ideas how to do operations on the launch pad? Instead of fueling the rocket a day before, why not fuel it 10 minutes before you want to launch it? There are a lot fewer complexities in doing it if you fuel it just on time. In theory, the purchasing agencies and NASA, the civilian agency, said, that's great. How many have you launched? He said, none. I have an idea for a rocket company. What's your previous experience? I had a payment system company that I sold for a lot of money, but I really think we can do this. They had zero experience doing it. Yes, it was Elon Musk. We had some role in persuading NASA that it was worth to invest some money in insurance to fund the capability to put him in a position to be an alternative. And our question is, if the other venture doesn't deliver, what's your next move? Who's going to show up to help? This guy has a good business model. It's worth you spending some money on him. Well, they did it. And what's been the result? Lockheed Martin has launched 160 satellites in a row since the ULA was formed. Every one of them a success. That's not 95 out of 100. That's 160 out of 160. So that's working well, thank God. What about SpaceX? SpaceX is the most significant, successful launch vehicle company in the world today. They put humans in space. They're launching national security payloads. They're so far ahead in coming up with ideas that'll put people back on the moon and send them to Mars as well. This is the guy who hadn't done anything. By the way, he came up with some other idea about a car as well, and worked on that later on. And this was hugely risky. All of this could have fallen on its face. It all could have been a giant, tremendous flop. You just didn't know. Was some of this luck? Yes. Thank you. I'll take it. But was some of it, at least, I think, an attentiveness to these kinds of considerations, ultimately telling NASA, if you'll invest in the capability, you'll have an option later on that you'll be happy with. I think, how do public agencies do this? You have to know a lot about the sector in question. You have to look at it from the point of view of the people who are buying the equipment and think about what capabilities are important to you. That tells you who's going to be a good player. You have to have data sets on your own experience so that in this 40-year period in which some of these issues have factored into the decision-making, you have to remember what you did. Agencies aren't always really good at doing that. Ex post assessment case studies tells you about which of your judgments were right, what kinds of investments made sense, what kind of capabilities have to be supported, whether you did the right analysis. And because you're not going to know all of this yourself, you have to collaborate with other public bodies and research institutions. The FTC and DOJ could not have done the work they did without the RAND researchers in the background, providing lots of sector-specific information. Perhaps for other sectors that are highly dynamic, you can form those kind of partnerships too. So I think we've done some of it. And we've done some of it with real success. And my thought is it could probably be replicated to some degree. Thanks.
Thank you very much for having me in this really interesting program. I know that you're going to be disappointed. I'm going to be less provocative than our first speaker and less entertaining than the second one, because I come in with a personal agenda on this issue. There was a reference to the fact that I chair the competition committee of OECD. And in fact, in the competition community of OECD, we've started to worry about how we were dealing with the issue of innovation. And we have two exercises which are planned, one in June and one in December. The first one is to explore the general relationship, what economists can tell us about the relationship between competition and innovation. And the second one in December, how can we implement what we've learned from the economy? So this initiative comes exactly at the right time, certainly for me, and that's why I'm particularly interested in this debate. Having said that, I'm going to take a much more pedestrian approach than, or pragmatic approach than my predecessors. The first one is that today, I've hardly heard the word law. But when we talk about competition law enforcement, we're talking about a legal instrument. We are talking about an intrusion, a state intrusion into the individual economic freedom of agents. This is tolerable only to a certain extent. It requires an instrument that will provide limits to the intrusion, legal certainty on how it's going to be used, transparency on how it is applied. Also, hopefully, the fact that it is indeed able, particularly in the merger area, since we're talking about merger control mostly today, to distinguish between the bad mergers and the good mergers. And finally, it has to be administrable or manageable in terms of the resources of the institutions who are in charge of this. So there are two ways to deal with this. One of them is to rely on presumptions, and the other one is to try to find intelligent way, with the help of economists, to establish standard of proof that meets the criteria which I've mentioned. And this is, in fact, what we are trying to do in the context of OECD, and which I think is long overdue. When I think historically, at least in the European context, about the relationship between competition and innovation in merger enforcement in general, I think there are four different stages. The first stage is innovation is antagonistic to competition. The second stage is innovation is too speculative to be worth spending a lot of time on. The third one is let's look at competition as a source of, let's look at innovation as a source of future competition, which was referred to. And the fourth one may be what are the added complexities in the relationship between competition and innovation, which are due to the nature of the digital sector. Now, it seems to be naive as a presentation of four different steps, but I can assure you that we in Europe went through those four steps. Just to make it very short, I will remind everybody around here of the 1996 merger decision AT&T NCR, Okay, so AT&T and NCR were going to merge and to bring together two technology, the computing technology and the telecom technology. And they were going to invent intelligent pay stations, terminals. And when you read the decision, you see that the commission was in a bind. It said, well, if they succeed, if they innovate, they're going to have a dominant position and I should block this merger. But I don't really want to do that. So I write in the decision that they are going to fail because there have been past attempts to do that, to invent what is basically a computer, and which have failed. So because they're going to fail, there is not going to be any innovation, no dominant position. I can therefore allow the merger. So this was really the first, and I'm not making up things. I mean, it's literally what's written in the decision. Third step, I said, look at innovation as a source of future competition. I think that this morning, Pierre Gibault talked about that, and that we do have example. The best example I have in mind, which is also the most recent, is the Dow-DuPont merger, where there was a real attempt at looking at whether this merger, which didn't have a lot of overlap at the time of the merger, but could in the future have overlap. So there was a real attempt to look at possible innovations that where there could be an overlap. What happened in the Dow-DuPont decision, I think, is that, of course, the diversion theory, which is comes from the static approach to competition, was very much used to think about what could happen in the pipeline. I mean, not even the pipeline, but in the future research of both parties to the merger. And there was a concern about the fact that each one could internalize the fact that if they merged, their research would not be as productive because the part of the result would decrease the sales of the other part, of the other merging parts. But what happened is not so much this, is what followed the decision. What followed the decision was a flurry of interesting economic articles that said, well, yeah, we buy the diversion story, but it's only one of many stories on in a case like this. You have the knowledge diffusion story, you have the spillover story, you have the coordination of R&D investment story within the merged firm, you have the sequential innovation. Regibault and Rocket have written about this. The problem with this was that, first of all those papers came pretty much at the time of the merger. They were not established much before that. Julien Le Fouilly and the Nicolo, etc. You had a lot of paper coming out, which meant that the literature was not terribly well developed. I mean, it was in the process of being developed thanks to this merger. The second thing is that those effects went in different directions. The diversion ratio was clearly something which was concerning, but some of the other effects were in fact likely to lead to an improvement or an increase in the research and development efforts of the firms and in its productivity. And there's no real easy way to weigh all those different effects. So one can describe them. I mean, one find new effects every other day, but one can describe them. But once you have them, we don't really have a unifying theory that would tell us how to deal with all of them. The fourth level is, are there added complexity in the digital sector? And I think there are two added complexities. One of them is just the extreme competition between dominant technologies. And even people like Dennis Carlton, for example, have written that competition theory is not very well adapted to cases where dominant technology is displaced by another dominant technology, because this was not the concept that was underlying economic theory. But there's a second thing, which is some specificities of the digital markets, which we have talked about today. I would add a couple of ones, but one of them, of course, is that competition is not between pipeline firms, but between ecosystems that may have different business models. So the issue of what is the appropriate business model for an innovation that doesn't come up really in the traditional merger approach, even in pharmaceutical sector or high-tech sectors, but it does come up in the issue of, in the question of the digital markets. The fact that intellectual property rights are possibly less important or don't play as prominent a role. And the fact that competition is through differentiation and diversification of the ecosystems. So that puts, in fact, the question of innovation, adds variables to the variables that we use traditionally to look at the issue of innovation when we do, and makes the issue even more complicated. So one of the questions that we have to solve, it's fairly easy, I think, to have a concept of innovation in the non-digital sector. Now, I do have qualms about whether we're able to define what is an innovation in the digital sector. Because one of the tendencies is to say, because firms compete on quality and differentiation, everything they do is an innovation. But once I see that, yeah, does it agree? I don't agree with this, but exactly where do we stop? Is a combination of service and innovation? Is what level of differentiation do we need to have innovation? So that's the first thing that we have to look at. The second is, and this has been the talk that we've heard, the dynamics of competition and innovation, particularly in the digital sector. What's more, this is the appropriate time to do it because we have a number of relatively recent mergers, such as Facebook, Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp, Google Waze, Meta, Giphy, which are being reconsidered, either officially or if it's not officially, at least in the literature. So this is a great time where we have plenty of past cases that we can revisit with new instruments if we have those new instruments. So the question is really, what are the new instruments? And to see whether by chance we made the right decision or by design we made the right decision, or what should have been the right decision. And we have also cases that are in the process of being adjudicated. I think of Adobe Figma, for example, which is a typical case of that kind. Now, we've heard two approaches, David Teece's approach and Bill Kovachik's approach. I'm not going to summarize David Teece because he did it excellently. I will just mention the fact that I was quite interested by a reference that he has in his paper to another paper by Merman and Vogt, who are two scholars in the strategic management field, and look at innovation and the capabilities of innovation in this sector by looking both at incumbents, looking at firms which are potential entrants, and others. So they look at Volkswagen, Google, and Tesla. What they do is that they analyze what you need to be able to innovate in this sector, in the electric vehicle sector. And they come up with a list of 26 qualities that you need to have, which are in three categories: market capabilities, technological capabilities, and business model capabilities. And then they rate each one of those 26, and then they add them together to try to get an indicator of who is closer to having all the capabilities that are necessary. Now, this kind of approach leads me seen from the point of view of competition authority, to have a few questions. The first question, of course, is that when you see the amount of data that they've had to treat for one case, first, deciding what are the 26 capabilities that you need in this particular sector, because it's sector specific. Second, how you measure it. Third, where you find the information. You realize that this cannot be what competition authorities do, because they don't have either the personnel or the resources to do it. So this raises immediately an institutional question. I mean, David has appealed to the profession of economists to move forward on research, but that research does not exist, as he said, yet, or not sufficiently. And second, if competition authorities were trying to duplicate it, they would just be swamped by, I mean, it would be just impossible. Maybe what would not be impossible would be some kind of collaboration between competition authorities and sectoral regulators, when they are sectoral regulators, because presumably those sectoral regulators know a lot about how those sectors work and possibly have a lot of this data. But one would have to think about precisely how this would work. The alternative, I think, by the way, is an alternative which has been raised in the case of the digital sector, is to say, oh, competition authority should have people who are specialized in the digital sector. I thought that this discussion was often very empty, because the idea was, I mean, it was not clear whether we needed technicians or whether we needed commercial people when you have a business policy in the digital sector. So we'll see what happens when the new division of the European Commission is fully operational. The second question is, how predictable are the management capacities? Because it's fine. Let's assume that maybe at an aggregated level, we could get some idea. How much can we count on them to establish what is going to be a long-term decision of allowing or not allowing a merger? I must say that I was alerted to this by David Teece himself in what he wrote in a paper that he sent me, where he was taking the example of Apple becoming, a success in the mobile telephony sector. And there was a note on the fact that Ballmer, Bill Gates, and Ottolini were people who at the time thought that Apple had no future in mobile telephony.
Bill Gates.
Huh?
Just Ballmer.
Just Ballmer. Okay. So Ballmer and Ottolini, but Microsoft, top guys at Microsoft and Intel. Now, if those guys are wrong, what is the probability that the competition authority trying to investigate the capability is going to be right? And I'm saying this because we talked about the OFT, and I was at the OFT at some point, and the OFT did look at the Instagram merger, the Facebook-Instagram merger, and asked everybody around, everybody in the sector, is there any chance that Instagram could become a competitor of Facebook, could become a social network? And every knowledgeable person laughed and said, absolutely not. I mean, this is a photo app. It has no future. Now, if those people are not able themselves to see what are the capabilities and what can competition authorities do? So that's my second question. The third one comes out of the article. The article is very interesting, and it shows in particular that Tesla's capabilities have considerably increased over time, which basically means, that's what the authors say. I don't know whether that's true or not. But what that suggests is that capabilities cannot be taken as constant, even if we know them. And if they change over time, what can we base ourselves on to, if we use them to try to solve a merger problem? Okay, so we do have those, I do have those questions in the case of David Teece. Going to Bill Kovacic, I think his paper is really interesting. And it makes an extremely important point, which is the fact that if you have a pro-competitive industrial policy, then the life of competition authorities is much easier. And I quite agree with that. And I think that this is one lesson. I mean, talk quite a bit about procurement and how there was an attempt to animate competition through procurement as well as through the financing of research and development. I think personally that's what we need in Europe, that kind of approach. But that doesn't say much about, I mean, there's a second part of the article, which is the fact that not every competition authority has a chairman who spent 2 years in the industry that was reviewing a merger, and where the head of the agency has a culture, an understanding, a deep understanding of the sector. So that cannot be a general solution to the problem we have, even if it's usually interesting. And the common point is that, in fact, the questions that they ask and that Bill showed on the slides are fairly similar. Okay, so I want to finish with the fact that at least we have the questions fairly clearly in mind that we should try to resolve. And they are suggested by David Teece in his article. He suggests that there would not be an innovation concern in a merger if, in the case of a large platform, for example, buying a startup, if first there is plenty of existing competition to the merged firm, if there are other likely or possible competitors, and if the acquired startup left alone would not be a viable competitor to the acquiring platform, or if the business model of the acquired startup is not proven at the time of the acquisition. And finally, if the acquired startup stays viable in the ecosystem after the merger. Okay, so I think that those questions are indeed questions that every competition authority should have in its mind when it's looking at a merger. The basic problem is, how do I get an answer to those questions? Now, I appeal to you. The ETA for all this is to be December 2023, so that the competition committees of OECD have the wisdom of your collective thinking. But I would like to remind you that I think it's easier to start with simple, maybe not too precise answers, but simple answers, so that competition authority will get into the habit of asking those questions with a bit of a handle. Then more and more sophisticated work can come to help them refine their thinking. Thank you very much.
Yeah, let me just make a few comments. I know we're out of time, so I'll be very.
How about if we just cancel dinner and we just break up into workshops?
Yes.
First of all, I have to begin by declaring that I'm not a pessimist, Bill. I'm actually an optimist, but I'm an optimist because of the Dynamic Competition Initiative and people like you that are getting into this. But here's my, Bill, what you said about the defense sector just resonates, of course, very much with what we're trying to do here. Why isn't this written up? Why isn't it codified? Why don't I see this in the guidelines? You know, it's what I call the surreptitious embrace of capabilities. And you can take the XM Sirius merger, which Greg Cited and I wrote up, where in fact these sort of arguments are used, but no one wants to admit it because it says that there's something wrong or something missing in the standard approaches. So you would benefit the world, and maybe we have to join forces to help with Fred with his problems here, because if this strength, you know, you mentioned it's there for the defense industry, you were clear that it wasn't across the board. So you have to take it from the defense industry, apply it across the board, and then also bring it into the context of platforms. And that's the hard bit. This is a lot of heavy lifting. And I can see that in the context of the defense industry, you have actually dealt with exactly the issues that the dynamic competition framework that we're putting forward thinks are important. So you owe it to us to codify it now. You've done a good start today, and then together we'll feed it to Fred, and we'll be quite some distance down the road to actually getting better policy. And Fred, your question about, well, this is impossible because after all in my paper, by the way, he's making reference to a paper that's forthcoming in the Columbia Journal of Business and Law, Business and Law, I think it is, where I have a quote that from not only Barmer, but also Ortolini, who is CEO of Intel. They all got it wrong with respect to what were the drivers of competition in the smartphone industry. And it's not by accident. Barmer is a Stanford MBA, Ortolini is a Berkeley MBA. This is not in the curriculum. The time they went through, there was no capability stuff, even in the business school.
Anybody can get through the grad program at Berkeley.
Yeah, we know that. We know that. So it's yeah. So my point is that actually this is a deficiency, has been a deficiency also in the business school curriculum till recently, but there now is a significant research base. It's by no means where you want it to be, but there's a way forward here, leveraging the capabilities we have. And it's my view, Fred, we'll never get it right, but at least we'll be asking the right questions. And if we ask the right questions, we've got a better chance of getting it right, rather than putting on blinders and going off and churning through a whole bunch of market data and output data forever and a day, even though it doesn't inform the issues at hand.
Two brief comments. The first one is that I have to support David's idea that those three people should go together and make things right. There's, by the way, a movie you know, which is called The Three Amigos, right? So I think that's a reference. Also, something that a very small example of a case where the Commission at least tried to think about capabilities. There was a couple of years ago an exchange of division between Glaxo and another of the big pharmaceutical. The vaccine division went from one to the other, and the oncology division went from the other there. But still, because of the situation in the oncology market, there's a requirement that the mother firm of the oncology sector retain some minimum capabilities in the field. Now, did they do that right and have a serious analysis of what would constitute sufficient capability to retain? Probably not, but at least the intention was there.
Good, thank you. Thank you, all of you. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions, but we'll take them for the reception, I think. Thank you all.